All right, folks, we're going to do a little niche video topic here today. We're going to be covering the idea of Hitler's anti-communism. Now, this is a bit of a confusing topic. I myself was duped into a position on this about a year and a half ago, thinking that Hitler really was an anti-communist, because he said that he was, right? He went up and gave speeches and railed against the communists, did all that anti-communist propaganda. So he really hates communism, man. He really hates him. He called himself a socialist, but he really hates communism. So we're going to actually debunk the idea that Hitler was anti-communist and that National Socialism is anti-communist. Now, Hitler was kind of a Machiavellian. He was a tactician. So it sounded like he hated communism because he said that he did, but when you look into the details and you dig into the details, it's hard to come to the conclusion that he genuinely was against communism. Communism meaning the state ownership of the means of production as an economic concept, which is the main thrust of communism. The main goal of all communists, whether it was Stalin, Mao, Lenin, or Trotsky, was to socialize the means of production, was to abolish private property. That's the fundamental tenet of the Communist Manifesto, Das Kapital, right? 90% of Marx is just economics. There is social aspects to the doctrine, but those can be reformed and changed, as you saw in the Soviet Union. But what isn't ever reformed and changed is the economics. The economics remain the same. They never do away with the economics. As soon as they do away with the economics, they cease being communist, right? As soon as the communist state allows private property, it allows private enterprise, it's no longer a communist regime. It's no longer a communist system. It is now a mixed economy or a capitalist-oriented economy. So that's the main thrust of it. So this here is kind of some traditional NatSoc symbolism messaging here, right? Anti-communist, anti-capitalist. Now, this is somewhat contradictory, right? It's like negating both of the main economic systems of the 19th, 20th centuries. How can you be against both of these things at the same time? Wouldn't that cancel each other out? If you're against both of them, what are you advocating then? If you're against both of them. So what they'll generally tell you is that they're for like a third position, right? That's what we're about. We're about a third position. Now, when I hear the term third position, what I think would be the natural conclusion there is that you're for a mixed economy, mixing together socialism and capitalism. But that's generally not true with these people because we already have a mixed economy in every Western country. And so they would just be advocating for the exact same thing we have now, more or less. So every Western country today is a mixed economy, right? It's a Keynesian mixed economy. We have state-owned or controlled central banks. Every Western country has one of those. Every country has one of those. We have public schools. We have public health care, partially public health care. We got state subsidies to farms. We got unemployment payments, all kinds of welfare and handouts, food stamps, food banks. We got loans to students, loans to businesses. There's some states that even give home loans. You have bailouts of companies. You have the state insuring bank accounts, and they'll bail out people. If a bank goes under, they'll bail out the depositors. They just did that with that Silicon Valley Bank. They have public-private partnerships. You have state-owned enterprises. Governments literally own companies. They own telecom companies. They own oil and gas companies. Think about Gazprom in Russia. Think about Norway. The state owns the oil company. In Spain, they own the main telecom company. States own companies. States have state enterprises, right? Canada, you got crown corporations. They bail out companies when they're in distress. They have a ton of regulations Regulations up the ass. Actually, I'm going to pull up right here a chart about regulations in the U.S. So this is American regulations, 1950, very few of them, right? And then we just see a straight shot up. Now, this is certainly not something that free market people would want, right? If it was truly free market, it would have hovered around here, minimal regulations, if not any regulations, right? But instead, it's going up and up and up. We got the taxes in the U.S., 91 different taxes. That's not something that, capitalists want. Tax code regulations, over 10 million words in length. Those just keep going up and up and up. So we generally have Keynesianism. We have mixed economies, right? So Mussolini, the founder of fascism, loved Keynes. He says, fascist Benito Mussolini had high praise for John Maynard Keynes. Says fascism entirely agrees with Mr. Maynard Keynes, despite the latter's prominent position as a liberal. I don't know what he means by that. I mean, he was essentially leaning towards the socialist side. In fact, Mr. Keynes' excellent little book, The End of Laissez-Faire, might, so far as it goes, serve as a useful introduction to fascist economics. There's scarcely anything to object to in it, and there's much to applaud. So the founder of fascism said the basis of his economics is Keynes. Keynes is essentially the godfather of modern economies all across the West. So there's plenty of fascist economics going on in the West right now. We all have mixed economies. So when you hear them say this, what are they referring to, right? So you had even Tony Blair say, he said he's for a third way. He's for a new capitalism, a third way, supports the pursuit of greater egalitarianism in society through action to increase the distribution of skills, capacities, and productive endowments while rejecting income redistribution as the means to achieve this. Emphasizes a commitment to balanced budgets, providing equal opportunity, blah, 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 blah. Public-private partnerships, etc. You could argue that we already have this third position in every single Western country. You got social housing, right? State housing. You have all kinds of state-funded education, state-funded healthcare, state-subsidized industry. All of that is going on. So don't we already got this fascist third position that you're talking about? But when you hear them talk about this, they always complain about the modern economies and say, actually, they're not socialist enough. You never hear them argue that they're too socialist, right? You never hear them say, we got too much socialism. We need less regulations. We need less taxation. We need less control. We need less state ownership. You never hear Nat Sock say that, right? They always try to label these mixed economies as capitalists and say they're too capitalist. We need more socialism. We need more state ownership. We need more state control. So they are clearly leaning towards the communist side. So they might as well just take this thing off and say, why do they even call themselves anti-communist? And they are, right? They are socialists. And socialists and communists, that's an interchangeable phrase there. They both want the socialization of the means of production. So this is false advertising, in my view. They're not truly anti-communist if they are socialists and identify as socialists. And then when you hear them talk, they're almost exclusively anti-capitalist, right? They're always for higher taxation, not less, for more regulation, not less, for more social welfarism and not less, for more state ownership and not less, because they're on the communist side there, right? So let's get into the idea that Hitler was an anti-communist. The Machiavellian Hitler who talked a big game against communism, but was he truly anti-communist? Well, when you get into details, it turns out that the answer is no. I've become convinced over the past 8 months of looking into this that he was not truly anti-communist. His actions are different than his words, and we have to look at his actions and not his words. So let's go through some of the evidence here briefly. So this is from my article called Hitler Said Slavs Were an Inferior Race Incapable of Statecraft and Planned to Subjugate Them, and that's what it's mainly about. But if you scroll down here, I also cover pretty extensively why Hitler was not an anti-communist, and I go through some pieces of evidence. So I guess one of the main arguments the traditional view will throw out is that he said he was an anti-communist in propaganda and speeches and so on, therefore he was, but that's not sufficient because he said a lot of things, right? He said he loved England at one point, and then he went to war with them. He made a deal with Stalin, and then he broke the deal. So he said a lot of things and did a lot of different things. So let's actually look at that first. The Hitler-Stalin deal. I think this is proof in and of itself that he's not anti-communist. What kind of anti-communist would make a significant military alignment agreement with the leading communist state in the world, the Soviet Union? They wouldn't. An anti-communist is an anti-communist, meaning an anti-communist would be doing sanctions against the Soviet Union. An anti-communist would be trying to undermine the Soviet Union from the get-go. There'd be no deal, right? So he wasn't a true anti-communist then. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was a non-aggression pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union that partitioned Eastern Europe between them, signed in August 1939 by Joachim von Ribbentrop and Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov, officially known as the Treaty of Non-Aggression between Germany and the Soviet Union. The treaty was a culmination of negotiations for economic agreement between the USSR and Nazi Germany. Yes, they did a lot of trade. They were trading resources with each other as well. And a political agreement. On August 22nd, Ribbentrop flew to Moscow to finalize the treaty. It guaranteed peace between the parties and was a commitment neither government would aid or ally itself with an enemy of the other. In addition to the publicly announced stipulations of non-aggression, the treaty included a secret protocol which defined the borders of Soviet and German spheres of influence across Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Finland. The secret protocol recognized the interest of Lithuania in the Vilnius region, and Germany declared its complete uninterest in Bessarabia. The rumored evidence of the secret protocol was proven only when it became public during the Nuremberg trials. Soon after the pact, Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, and then Soviet leader Stalin ordered the Soviet invasion of Poland on September 17th. After the invasions, the new borders between the two countries was confirmed by the supplementary protocol of the German-Soviet Frontier Treaty. They actually held a joint victory parade. Soviet and German officers meet at the Polish city of Brest. So this is also pretty astonishing, right? So if they truly are these vicious enemies, why are they meeting up together and celebrating? On the left, Soviet officer and a German officer come together to celebrate the victory over Poland. It says, when the Soviet 29th Tank Brigade approached, the commanders negotiated that the German troops would withdraw and the Soviet troops would enter the city saluting each other. At Brest-Litovsk, Soviet and German commanders held a joint victory parade before German forces withdrew westward behind a new demarcation line. And there is a video of this as well. There you see them hanging out together, having a great time. Soviet Nazi collaboration here, guy. So the apologists for this are going to argue, well, it's just a non-aggression pact. He just did it so that, he could stave off an attack or something. So it wasn't even only just Hitler. Mussolini made a pact of friendship, neutrality, and non-aggression between Italy and the Soviet Union, known as the Italo-Soviet Pact, signed on September 2nd, 1933. This was way before that. The Soviets and Italians maintained contacts since December 26, 1921, the signing of trade agreement and full diplomatic relations on February 7th, 1924, making fascist Italy the first Western nation to recognize the Soviet Union. In 1933, the two powers moved closer together by signing economic and pact supporting industrialization goals. Italy required access to Soviet oil and coal, while the Soviets were interested in Italian innovations in the aviation, automobile, and naval industries. The ideological conflict between Italian fascism and Soviet Bolshevism was largely considered an internal matter, and relations were built up nevertheless. It says, reports in the Telegraph Agency of the Soviet Union were keen to stress the military aspect of this. In September 1933, a Soviet military mission visited Rome, and Vladimir Petrovich Potemkin, who served as the Soviet ambassador to Italy from 1932 until 1934, expressed gratitude for the exceptional attention devoted to the Soviet mission by the Italian commanding government, while a general from the Italian military stated the Italian army has feelings which go deeper than the usual professional ones towards the Red Army. These feelings have been strengthened as a result of the Italo-Soviet Pact. You can go read that for yourself, the Italo-Soviet Pact. When Hitler made the agreement with Stalin, this is one of the things, this is from this article here called When Stalin Was Hitler's Ally. He said, between 1939 and 1941, as the Soviet Union presented Nazi Germany in its own internal propaganda as a friendly state, Soviet society ceased to criticize German policies and began to publish Nazi speeches. People in public meetings occasionally misspoke, praising Comrade Hitler or calling for the triumph of international fascism. Swastikas began to appear on buildings or even on posters of Soviet leaders. A similar level of ideological confusion is evident in Russia today. So that is quite an astonishing set of affairs there, right? That they started to actually praise each other. So there's more on that in this article here. It says the treaty startled people everywhere. Both Stalin and Hitler knew that their internal propaganda machines would have to work hard to change current public opinion within their nations and also to change the negative perceptions that each country had been cultivating about the other. Historian Roger Moorhouse says this: the tone of public and cultural life in the Soviet Union shifted after the signing of the pact. From one day to the next, the newspapers stopped criticizing Nazi Germany and instead began lauding German achievements. As Kravchenko, a factory director, said, the Society for Cultural Relations with Foreign Countries instantly discovered the wonders of German culture. Visiting Moscow on business, I learned that several exhibits of Nazi art, Nazi economic achievements, and Nazi military glory were on view, or in the process of organization. In fact, everything German was in vogue. In Germany, people were equally surprised. As in the Soviet Union, official propaganda reversed itself, and quickly after its years of attacks on Soviet communism, according to Moorhouse. The public discourse was uniformly positive about the pact, with German newspapers immediately altering the tone with which they reported Soviet current affairs on Russian culture. Where reporters and editors had once been unable to resist inserting at the very least a derogatory adjective or a critical aside, they now reported events with scrupulous even-handedness. On the morning of the Pact's announcement, the newspapers seemed desperate to make the case for the new arrangement. Every title carried almost verbatim reports and commentaries, scripted under Goebbels' supervision, rejoicing at the restoration of the traditional friendship between the Russian and the German peoples. In the Nazi newspaper Volkischer Beobachter, Foreign Minister Ribbentrop congratulated himself by lauding his achievement as one of the most important turning points in the history of our two peoples. Even in the House newspaper, the SS star Schwarzkopf towed the optimistic line, reminding the readers in a gallop through Russia and Soviet history that the Empire of the Tsars had originally been a Germanic state, that it had twice saved Prussia, and that it had paid dearly for its enmity with Germany in World War I. Echoing Ribbentrop, the newspaper concluded that the two countries had always flourished when they were friends, and so looked forward to the new era of collaboration. Also, let me pull up the Ribbentrop quote. This is from Peter Longrich's Goebbels biography. It says, talking to Ribbentrop just back from Moscow on September 30, Goebbels criticized what he felt Ribbentrop's all-too-positive assessment of the Soviet Union, something he carefully avoided doing with Hitler, as though Bolshevism was just a kind of national socialism. So Ribbentrop himself said that Bolshevism is a kind of national socialism. Well, what's going on here, guy? These don't sound like enemies anymore. So, of course, one of the quotes that they'll use to deny all of this and to argue that he really was anti-communist was this narrative that they foster about how Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union was designed to save the world from communism. He's trying to take down the communists and destroy communism once and for all. But this is a lie. When you actually look into the details, it seems superficially convincing just based on the fact that he did invade the Soviet Union. But why did he invade the Soviet Union? Did he invade the Soviet Union to destroy communism and save everybody from communism? Or did he invade the Soviet Union to steal the land of Eastern Europe to achieve Lebensraum? Clearly, the latter. So if you go through my article here on this topic, it makes no sense to say that Hitler really wanted to save the Slavic peoples from communism when he hated the Slavic peoples and said that they were an inferior race. He says in Mein Kampf, right here, he declares, "For the organization of a Russian state formation was not the result of political abilities of the Slavs in Russia, but only a wonderful example of the state-forming efficacy of the German element in an inferior race. Numerous mighty empires on earth have been created in this way. Lower nations led by Germanic organizers and overlords have more than once grown to be mighty state formations and have endured as long as the racial nucleus of the creative state race maintained itself. For centuries, Russia drew nourishment from this Germanic nucleus of its upper leading strata. Today it can be regarded as almost totally exterminated and extinguished." He says a similar thing here. He says the Nordic race is called to dominate the world, and this right must guide our foreign policy. It's why we cannot envision any rapprochement with Russia, which is a Slavic Tatar body surmounted by a Jewish head. I knew Slavs from my home country. In the era where a Germanic head ruled the Slavic body, entente was possible. Bismarck outlined this rapprochement before, but today it would be a crime. He says, in his eyes, the entente with England corresponded with the imperative, the goal of Nordic domination of Europe, and through America, Nordic Germanic domination of the world. We want to assure the domination of the world in concert with the Anglo-Saxons. And if you go through all this evidence I lay out, he's constantly slagging off the Slavic peoples, their inferior race, their animals. He calls them animals. Goebbels' diary has that quote. Goebbels called them animals in his own diary. So if he hates them and wants to subjugate them, then how could he be trying to save them or liberate them from communism? On top of that, he signed Molotov-Ribbentrop, which gave Stalin the green light to invade Poland and invade the Baltics and conquer them. And they split up and divvied up and celebrated together their conquest of these countries. So he's going to save them from communism, even though he helped bring communism to Poland and the Baltics and Eastern Europe to begin with in the first place. That's fairly convenient for Hitler, right? I sign an agreement that brings communism to half of Poland and the Baltics, and now I rescind the agreement and I'm going to save you from him. It's all just fucking tactical crap. So going through this, I prove that the real agenda was Lebensraum, and I lay out clearly here that was the number one foreign policy goal of Hitler. Was Lebensraum was expanding the living space of Germany, and that was the real motivation for the war, and that's actually confirmed by a secret meeting from July 1941. Martin Bormann's minutes of a meeting from July 16th, 1941. So this had Rosenberg, Lammers, Field Marshal Keitel, Goering, and others were at this meeting. So let me just read the highlighted parts here. It says, it was essential that we should not proclaim our aims before the whole world. Also, this was not necessary, but the chief thing was that we ourselves should know what we wanted. In no case should our own way be made more difficult by superfluous declarations. Such declarations were superfluous because we could do everything whenever we had the power to do so, and what was beyond our power we would not be able to do anyway. What we told the world about the motives for our measures ought to be conditioned, therefore, by tactical reasons. We ought to proceed here in exactly the same way we did in cases of Norway, Denmark, Holland, and Belgium. In these cases, too, we said nothing about our aims, and if we were clever, we would continue in the same way. We shall then emphasize again that we were forced to occupy, administer, and secure a certain area. It was in the interest of the inhabitants that we should provide order, food, traffic, hence our measures. It should not be recognizable that thereby a final settlement is being initiated. We can nevertheless take all necessary measures, shooting, resettlement, and we shall take, but we do not want to make any people into enemies prematurely and unnecessarily. Therefore, we shall act as though we wanted to exercise a mandate. It must be clear to us, however, that we shall never withdraw from these areas. Accordingly, we should act. 1. To do nothing which may obstruct the final settlement, to prepare for it in secret, to emphasize that we're liberators. So there's the propaganda. We're liberating you from communism. It's convenient, but the secret mission was to conquer. In particular, the Crimea has to be evacuated by all foreigners and to be settled by Germans only. In the same way, the former Austrian part of Galicia will become Reich territory. In principle, we have now to face the task of cutting up the giant cake according to our needs, in order to be able first to dominate it, second to administer it, and third to exploit it. So that's a very clear statement in this secret meeting that the goal was not to liberate anyone from communism. It was to occupy, to dominate, and exploit them and their resources for Lebensraum. So that's the real motive of the war here. Now let me pull up this thing from David Irving. So this is from Hitler's War, David Irving. He says, Hitler says that Stalin had enormous achievements. He says, the next day, Papen also raised Stalin's future with Hitler, and the Fuhrer repeated what he had told Goebbels a month before, that once the Wehrmacht had occupied a certain forward line in Russia, it might be possible to find common ground with the Red Dictator, who was, after all, a man of enormous achievements. As another diplomat, Hasso von Ostdorf, noted, Hitler sees two possibilities as to Stalin's fate. Either he gets bumped off by his own people or he tries to make peace with us. Because he says Stalin, as the greatest living statesman, must realize that at 66 you can't begin your life's work all over again if it will take a lifetime to complete it. So he'll try to salvage what he can with our acquiescence. And in this, we should meet him halfway. If Stalin could only decide to seek expansion for Russia toward the south, the Persian Gulf, as Hitler recommended to him once in November 1940, then peaceful coexistence between Russia and Germany would be conceivable. So he's staying there. First of all, he's praising Stalin, saying he likes the guy, he's the greatest living statesman. And secondly, saying that the issue he had with Stalin was not ideological, really. He's not emphasizing his hatred of communism there or anything. He's saying the conflict is between the land space. They're both fighting over the same land space in the east of Europe. And he says if Stalin was simply to just take a turn down south, we'd have no issue with Stalin. Volker Ulrich, Hitler's downfall, he says, in the days that followed, much to the surprise of his lunch guests, Hitler continued to express his regard for Stalin. The Soviet dictator's life resembled his own. He told them the Georgian, too, had worked his way up from an unknown man to the leader of a state. So he respected Stalin. He liked Stalin. He defended Stalin. Let's pull up that article then. Where Hitler is praising the big guy. Praising the big guy, man. So this is from this article called How Hitler Became a Believer in the State-Planned Economy. It says, Hitler's view on the Soviet economic system apparently changed from skepticism to admiration. In a table talk on July 22, 1942, Hitler vehemently defended the Soviet economic system and even the so-called Stalin system, which was exceedingly stupid to ridicule. He said, one has to have unqualified respect for Stalin. In his way, the guy is quite the genius. His ideals, such as Genghis Khan and so forth, he knows very well, and his economic planning is so all-encompassing that it is only exceeded by our own 4-year plan. I have no doubts whatsoever that there have been no unemployment in the USSR as opposed to capitalist countries like the USA. Hitler's admiration for the Soviet system also confirmed in the notes of Wilhelm Schicht, who, as an adjunct to Hitler's representative for military history, Walter Schurf, and a member of the Fuhrer headquarters group, had close contact with Hitler and sometimes took part in briefings. Schicht writes that Hitler underwent a conversion to Bolshevism. From Hitler's remarks, he says the following reactions could be derived. Firstly, Hitler was enough of a materialist to be the first to recognize the enormous armament achievement of the USSR in the context of her strong, generous, all-encompassing economic organization. Schicht writes that in the view of Hitler had recognized and expressed the inner relationship of his system with so heatedly opposed to Bolshevism, where he had to admit that the system of the enemy was developed far more completely and straightforwardly. His enemy became his secret example. So this is from an article called How Adolf Hitler Began to Admire Stalin. And in this one, gives similar quotes. He's kind of just praising Stalin. And it says he actually defended Stalin. It says Henry Picker recorded Hitler's table talks, reports on numerous further talks in which Hitler expressed admiration for Stalin or defended him against critical remarks. Hitler had always, for example, become angry when someone called Stalin a former bank robber. Hitler would then immediately defend Stalin and with the declaration that Stalin had not carried out his bank robberies as a private person nor for the benefit of his own pocket, but as a revolutionary and in order to finance the communist movement. Hitler said of Stalin, one has to have respect. He's quite a brilliant chap. Then he kind of just praises him because he built up the economy, and Hitler just respected power and anyone who had power, and it's essentially what his respect for Stalin is and amounts to. He respects strength and he respects power. So let's move on to some of the other elements of debunking this. Hitler was an anti-communist. Let's go to the economy itself. Okay, so you can't be an anti-communist if you are a socialist, because what is the goal of a socialist? The goal of a socialist is to socialize the means of production. Communists and socialists use those terms interchangeably, right? The USSR, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, use the term socialism and communism interchangeably. They're the same thing. You can split hairs all you want. There's different variants of socialism, but they all aim at the exact same thing, including syndicalism, which is the basis of fascism. It's the collective ownership, right? Syndicalism. It's trade unions collectively controlling industry. That's the same thing as communism. Same thing as the Soviet labor councils and all that. So here we look at the economic side of it. So Ludwig von Mises explained the German pattern of socialism like this. He said, the German pattern of socialism is characterized by the fact that it maintains, although nominally, some institutions of capitalism. Labor is no longer a commodity. The labor market has been solemnly abolished. The government fixes wage rates and assigns every worker the place where he must work. Yeah, that's true, right? If you cannot choose your own place of work, if you cannot choose your own profession, and the state is delegating labor, the state is delegating where people work, it's delegating how you work, where you work, how much you're paid, all of that stuff, then that's not capitalism, right? Because capitalism is voluntary. Private ownership has been nominally untouched. In fact, however, the former entrepreneurs have been reduced to the status of shop managers. The government tells them what and how to produce, at what prices, from whom to buy, at what prices, and from whom to sell. Business may remonstrate against inconvenient injunctions, but the final decision rests with the authorities. And there's the other famous quote from him where he says, the power of the economy, ownership, the function of ownership lies with the state. The power to be able to do with that property what you will lies with the state. This from Vampire Economy says, you have no idea how far state control goes and how much power the Nazi representatives have over our work. The worst of it is that they are so ignorant. In this respect, they certainly differ from the former Social Democrat officials. These Nazi radicals think of nothing except distributing the wealth. Some businessmen have even started studying Marxist theories so that they will have a better understanding of the present economic system. And that's quoting a German businessman who lived in Nazi Germany. So if businessmen are studying Marxist theories to understand the economic system, then you have a socialist system on your hands. It's just this panoply, this labyrinth of regulation and control and intervention that is functionally not distinct from the Soviet model. By 1936, the German economy was thrust into a fully planned system of centralized control. That's from this Hitler's confidential memo on autarky. It describes this. It says, in this confidential memorandum of 1936, Hitler explains why he believed it was necessary from an ideological military standpoint for the German economy to achieve autarky within 4 years. His comments became the basis of the so-called 4-year plan, which began in October of that year under the direction of Göring. The new plan for economic management aimed in particular to centralize mobilization of labor, restrict imports, impose wage and price controls, and allocate and synthesize raw materials. That's total control. That's total state-run economy. He's setting wages, setting prices, allocating the labor, restricting the imports. He's synthesized the raw materials. Everything is centralized. That's what socialism is. It's about centralizing the control. You can't do anything yourself. Nothing's voluntary. The market doesn't even exist anymore. It's state-run. So let's take a look at this clip of an economist, George Reisman, who explains the same point here.
Socialism is government ownership of the means of production, not a welfare state. Thus, for example, the various Nordic countries, such as Sweden and Denmark, should not be regarded as socialist countries. The overwhelming bulk of industry and property in those countries is privately owned, and production is carried on at the initiative of private businesses seeking to make profits and avoid losses. Indeed, taxes on business profits there have been lower than here. True examples of socialism. True examples of socialism are Soviet Russia, China under Mao, and Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany had a system of de facto socialism, in that the government exercised all the substantive powers of ownership. The Nazi government controlled all prices and wages and decided what was to be produced, where, in what quantities, by what methods, and who was to receive the products. Why establish...
Okay. So he states it there again. Control, control, control. That's not market. That's not a market. It's not a free market. And it's not a mixed economy either, because a mixed economy would allow some capitalism to happen. It wouldn't control rigidly every single market. It doesn't set all the prices, right? You can have a mixed economy and they're not setting all the prices. They're not setting all the wages except for maybe a minimum wage, right? It's not like they're going into every firm and telling the bosses, you have to pay people at this level, different salaries. No, they negotiate the wages between employer and employee, or between the union and an employer. It's not the state setting all that stuff, but in NS Germany and Fascist Italy, it's the state setting all of that, prices, wages, etc. So that's not a traditional mixed economy. It's a state-run, socialized economy. So let's move on to some of this other stuff here. It says 4-year plans, price and wage controls, state direction of labor, state direction of resource allocation. Does all of that sound like an anti-communist system to you? Hitler was an expert tactician and doublespeaker, that which he denounced in public he admired in private. Is this an admirable, trustworthy person or ruthless schemer? The idea that Hitler was an anti-communist crusader is a convenient propaganda myth that he crafted to win support for Barbarossa. He duped morons to sign up for this war to help get him Lebensraum, feeding them bullshit that he was going to eliminate communism while he was implementing communism. How can an avowed socialist eliminate communism when it's the same damn thing? How can someone who implemented a near-communist command and control war economy be a true anti-communist? So this is a speech Hitler gave in 1943 in which he said this. He said, instead, it will increasingly strive to realize, in the service of the national interests everywhere, a true Volksgemeinschaft as the highest ideal, all the more so after the war. The German National Socialist state, which pursued this goal from the beginning, will tirelessly work for the realization of a program that will ultimately lead to a complete elimination of class differences and the creation of a true socialist community. Complete elimination of class differences and the creation of a true socialist community. So through this speech, he's going off about Bolshevik this and Bolshevik that, and Bolshevism's bad. But then he advocates for Bolshevism. The elimination of classes, that's the fundamental tenet of Marxism, is the abolition of class differences. And the only way to eliminate class differences is to eliminate private property, because private property gives rise to class differences. People have different amounts of property, right? If a guy has 2 houses and a plot of land and a business, he's got more than a guy who doesn't. And so private property is the very basis of capitalism and it's the very basis of class stratification and class difference. In order to even all that out, you have to eliminate private property or severely restrict it. Maybe you let someone have, own a home or a particular size of a lot or something, but like nothing else. And if he goes above that, then you take it from him, right? So he says this was the goal from the beginning. That was always the goal, was to establish this totally socialized system. And it's they not only socialize the economy, but they socialize the people too, right? Like, you no longer have any autonomy. You don't make your own decisions economically, right? You don't choose your own career anymore. The state chooses your career for you. They can conscript you into the military. They can conscript your labor in a concentration camp. They can conscript your labor elsewhere in a factory. So like, you don't even decide your own job. If you can't decide, you don't have any life choices. You are just a slave of the state now, right? You've been socialized. You've been turned into a subject, a serf of the state. The state decides where you go. The state decides your life path, not you. And so that's also socialist. That's what every socialist state did, right? They decided, oh, you want to be a film director? Too bad. We already have that. We're going to make you into this. You're going to make shoes in this factory. That's taking total ownership over everybody, right? So this article here goes into the impressive number of German communists who joined the Nazi Party. It says one of the Nazi dictator's most faithful advisors, Otto Wagner, portrayed him as a convinced socialist. It quotes him saying, "We National Socialists wish precisely to attract all socialists, even the communists. We wish to win them over from the international camp to the national camp." And so that's the only change? From international to national? Now, I've explained before why this is kind of a false distinction, because this internationalism, you'll hear that Nat Sock say this, right? Like, but they're internationalists and we're nationalists. There's no such thing as internationalism. There's no international nation. This was just rhetoric. This was just solidarity with other communists around the world. It's like, we support you, man. Workers of the world unite. We support your struggle, bro. And maybe they even gave money to those people and intervened in foreign policy. But Hitler did that too. Hitler intervened in other conflicts, intervened in the Spanish Civil War, intervened in Austria, invaded other countries, was financing other countries. It was financing parties in Eastern Europe doing coups. He was doing internationalism too. If you want to define internationalism as just being internationally active and involved, then Nazism is also international. So the Soviets preached this internationalism, but it was just like the solidarity. When you look at communism, every communist state is national in the sense that it has national borders. It's a state. It's not anarchy. So they have a regime and they have borders. They have defined borders. That's a national state. So every communist state is national. National socialism guy. So he's not really getting to any distinction that's serious here. He's getting to a very flimsy distinction. It's just one in rhetoric alone. So what if Stalin simply changed his labeling from international to national, then he's now a national socialist? I guess so, right? It says in February 1932, the communist magazine AIZ dedicated an article to Scheringer entitled "Why I Was a National Socialist and How I Became a Communist," talking about militants kind of moving in between the two parties. Let me just read the highlighted portion here. It says, in relation to the passage of militants from KPD to the NSDAP, historian Timothy Scott Brown collected very interesting data in the book Weimar Radicals, Nazis and Communists Between Authenticity and Performance, noting on page 136 that in what as regards the SA, it is known that a significant part of the new recruits previously belonged to the KPD. Scott exposes the estimates collected by Rudolf Diels, first head of the Gestapo, the political police of the Third Reich, in his memoirs, pointing out that in Berlin, 70% of the new recruits to the SA were from January 1933 were former communists. The most striking fact of those indicated by Diels is that in some cases, entire Rotfront's units moved to the SA. The Social Democrat Albert Grzinski, head of the Berlin police between 1930 and 1932, pointed out that 30% of the members of the SA in Berlin were ex-communists as early as 1932. According to the historian, the SA themselves calculated at 55% the number of their militants who came from communist ranks. Brown points out that both the Gestapo files and the reports from the KPD intelligence apparatus confirm that considerable presence of former communists in the SA. In some cases, former communist militants held relevant positions in the repressive apparatus of the Nazi regime. So there was immense overlap and crossover. It was fairly easy traffic from communist parties to the Nazi party. Now, why do you think that is? Because they're so similar. It wouldn't make sense. You wouldn't see that kind of overlap. You wouldn't see that kind of transference if they weren't similar, at least economically, right? You wouldn't get like a hardcore libertarian, let's say people from like the Libertarian Party who love capitalism, just seamlessly moving into the Communist Party or the National Socialist Party, because there's too much difference between them, right? But here, there's not very much difference between them, especially on the economic front. It's almost identical. It's almost the same thing. Socialist and socialist, two types of socialists, right? They just emphasize a little bit more the race stuff, emphasize a little bit more the national sentiment, but the communists also did that as well. So let's look now at this video clip from Tick History about how Hitler was a communist before becoming a National Socialist. He attended the funeral of Kurt Eisner, a Jewish Marxist, in Germany, and he was essentially working for the Bavarian Soviet Republic. He was hand in glove with the Bavarian Soviet Republic, which was a short-lived kind of communist regime in Bavaria.
This is a picture of the funeral procession for Jewish socialist revolutionary Kurt Eisner, who had been a member of Karl Marx's party, the Social Democratic Party of Germany, the SPD, and yes, that is Hitler. There's also video footage of this event where Hitler is visible, although I can't show it here for copyright reasons, and there's contemporary evidence explaining why Hitler was elected into Kurt Eisner's Bavarian People's State, and then after Eisner's Socialist Republic collapsed, he was elected again into a Bavarian Soviet Republic, which was communist, and why, despite being a raging anti-Semite not long after, Hitler was attending the funeral of a Jewish socialist revolutionary who was the leader of that Bavarian Socialist Republic. Also, one of Hitler's chauffeurs, Julius Schreck, founder of the SS, and seen here with Adolf, fought in the Bavarian Red Army. And Freikorps Epp fought against this Soviet Republic with members including Ernst Röhm, Hans Frank, Rudolf Hess, and both of the Strassers, who were supposedly the left-wing element of the Nazi Party but were fighting against the communists in 1919, whereas Hitler and his chauffeur were fighting for them. There's a lot to unpack here, so let's go to Moscow. And yes, this was real communism or socialism or whatever you want to call it. On 14th of April 1919, the day after the Communist Räterepublik, Soviet Republic, had been proclaimed, the Munich Soldiers' Councils approved fresh elections of all barracks representatives to ensure that the Munich garrison stood loyally behind the new regime. In the elections the following day, Hitler was chosen as deputy battalion representative. Not only then did Hitler do nothing to assist in the crushing of Munich's Red Republic, he was an elected representative of his battalion during the whole period of its existence. Hitler not only supported Germany's communist regime during this brief time period, but also bestowed his blessings to a government that had pledged allegiance to Lenin's Soviet Russia in Moscow. Worse, having described this communist republic as a Jewish hegemony, Hitler effectively admitted that he had supported and was a part of a government that was wanting Jewish hegemony at this time, so it's no wonder he wanted to distance himself from this. Well, the revolutionary socialist government in Berlin, headed by Friedrich Ebert, leader of Karl Marx's Social Democratic Party, wasn't happy that Bavarian Bolshevik communists had declared independence from the rest of Germany, so he sent in his own revolutionary forces to put them down.
Interesting information there. So he's attending funeral of a Jewish Marxist. He's supporting a Soviet puppet government in Germany. Now, the excuse for this is that, this was when he was younger and he changed his ways and so on, but he didn't really change his ways, not that much. He did start his own party and start his own thing because he wanted to be the leader of this socialist experiment in Germany instead of following somebody else's lead, right? And then he added stuff to it later. So let's look at this part here. It says Hitler swapped out the international rhetoric of Marxist socialism and made it national, then wrapped the swastika around it and affixed German Nordicist racial ideas to it, Germanic racial Marxism. Hitler himself said in Mein Kampf that if you take away the Nordicist racial stuff, the ideology goes back to being Marxism. Hitler said, the racial Weltanschauung is fundamentally distinguished from the Marxists by reason of the fact that the former recognizes the significance of race and therefore also personal worth and has made these the pillars of its structure. These are the most important factors of its Weltanschauung. If the National Socialist movement should fail to understand the fundamental importance of this essential principle, it should merely varnish the external appearance of the present state and adopt the majority principle. It would really do nothing more than compete with Marxism on its own ground. So if you distill down what he's saying there, he's saying that he added racialism or Germanic in-group preference and racialism to Marxism, but if you take away the Germanic in-group preference, then it's just Marxism, right? It's just competing with Marxism on its own ground. It's a non-racial socialism. It's a class socialism. What Hitler did is he fused together class and race, but more specifically ethnic group, being Germanic, because he wasn't pro-white race to the same extent as he was pro-Germanic. He disliked the Slavs. He hated the Slavs and said they were inferior, right? So he didn't just love all white people. He only loved Germanics and Nordics. So he just created a racial variant of Marxism is what he's saying there, right? Goebbels himself said that the difference between communism and the Hitler faith was very slight, and that he'd rather go down with Bolshevism than capitalism. This quote is from the New York Times, where Goebbels gave a speech in it was like a bar or something, and he said that he actually admired Lenin. I'll pull up the actual thing here. It says, on the speaker's assertion that Lenin was the greatest man, second to Hitler, and the difference between communism and the Hitler faith was very slight. Goebbels himself is saying that Hitler and Lenin are pretty much the same thing to him. They're both leaders of socialism. So Goebbels was a hardcore socialist, right? He was a hardcore left-wing socialist. He says, we are socialists because we see in socialism the union of all citizens, the only chance to maintain our racial inheritance and to regain our political freedom. Socialism is the doctrine of the liberation of the working class. We want our freedom from the present slavery. Socialism, therefore, is a matter of the oppressed class fighting for its freedom. Let me find the other quote from Goebbels. The other quote is, he'd rather go down with Bolshevism from the slavery of capitalism. So these quotes pretty much prove Goebbels was a communist, right? So he says it would be better to go down with Bolshevism than the eternal slavery of capitalism. That's this source here. I can pull it up. It says, quote from Goebbels' diaries in The Devil's Disciples. And then this quote is from an article Goebbels wrote. It says, we want the Germany of labor. What does that mean? We want a Germany in which labor and accomplishment are the highest moral and political values. We are today a workers' party in the best sense of the word. Once we have taken over the state, Germany will become a state of labor, a workers' state. This is the exact same thing that Marxists preach. They want a labor state, a workers' state. They want the workers to seize the means of production through the state. Okay, they take control of the state, right? Lenin's vanguardism. We overthrow the state, take control of the state, and once we get control of the state, then we can seize all the private property and seize all the private business, because you can't do it without the state. And so socialism absolutely depends on taking control of the state, because the state has a monopoly on violence and a monopoly on the use of force, and it's the only entity that can implement socialism, right? Think about like the price controls that they want. The only way to do price controls is if you have policemen and spies everywhere looking at the prices, right? That's essential to the success of socialism, because if you can't control the prices, then people are just going to sell at what they want and earn a profit, right? And so to control that and to prevent them from earning a profit, you have to have spies looking at all the shops and making sure that they're following the state prices. And it would make sense for them to consolidate when they're trying to socialize the economy. It would make sense for them to actually consolidate the economy into fewer and fewer hands, kind of bring it into the hands of the big businesses and then take over the big businesses, because if there's less businesses to control, it's easier to control, right? So like that's actually what they did in Germany, is they got like they helped the big businesses consolidate their power and take control of markets, because they wanted to reduce the number of companies that they had to control. If it's only 5 companies you have to control instead of 30, it's easier for the state to regulate 5 companies than 30 companies or 50 companies and have to constantly do paperwork and go into the companies and do all that stuff. It's easier to when it's all centralized in the hand of a few companies, and all you have to do is either control those companies through regulations and dictates, or simply seize those companies eventually, right? But that's from an article Goebbels wrote called Nazi Saucy. If you want to go read it, Nazi Saucy, 10 Commandments for Each National Socialist. Real thing. He said that. And when you look at Goebbels' propaganda when he writes about socialism, he's spewing off constantly, like especially in that one. He's spewing off constantly about, workers and the working class and the bourgeoisie. If you look at the article, he's going off. He uses the term bourgeois constantly. Hitler uses that term as well. He's always, making these comparisons. The proletariat, like that word, proletariat. Like, look at this. Look how many times class struggle, proletariat. He's infused with Marxist language. Bourgeoisie, proletariat, working class, labor state, and so on. He's super clear about this. And when he critiques Bolshevism, and this is the trick, and this was the baffle gab of the propaganda at the time, was that whenever he critiqued Bolshevism and communism, you go read the critiques, he's not critiquing it for being socialist. He's not critiquing the socialism of it. He's critiquing the internationalism or the perceived lack of racialism or the lack of nationalism. That's it. He's not critiquing it on economic grounds at all. And in fact, he says he reaffirms the socialism. He says, like, we're the real socialists, essentially. If I can find it in there. It says, you talk of socialism, and then it says, he fought for 60 years not for socialism, but for Marxism. Marxism, whose theories are fatal to peoples and races, is the exact opposite of living socialism. The worker has no right to doubt socialism. So there it is. The worker has no right to doubt socialism, but the duty to doubt Marxism. This is complete baffle gab, because Marxism is a form of socialism, economic socialism, class socialism. So see these super thin hairs that he's splitting here, right? When you read this stuff. And he's always going off about capitalist profit and bourgeois wealth and this and that, because he's a poor guy and he's angry about that. But that line right there says it all. No right to doubt socialism. So you must be a socialist, an economic socialist. And he's just trying to make this false distinction between him and Marxist socialist, right? So that's what it is. It's all baffle gab. It's rhetoric. They're not truly against communism in the economic realm of things. They're only against the perceived lack of racial awareness of communism. But even that is weird, because they don't even want these countries to have that kind of, like, they wanted to destroy the Slavs. They wanted to take over the Slavs' land. And so, like, it's not like they want the Slavs to be a strong people who has self-pride. They're preaching that Slavs are an inferior race. I mean, Goebbels says that the Russians are barbaric animals. He says this in here. The Führer's verdict on the Poles, they're animals. And then Goebbels himself said, the incidents that Sepp Dietrich related to me about the Russian people in the occupied areas is hair-raising. They're not people, but a conglomeration of animals. So let's move on to Mussolini then. Mussolini was a fervent Marxist who cobbled together fascism as a slight revision of Marx. This is what Mussolini said about himself. It was inevitable that I should become a socialist, a Blancist, indeed a communist. I carried about a medallion of Marx's head in my pocket. I think I regarded it as a sort of talisman. Marx had a profound critical intelligence, and in some sense was a prophet. His entire political history, he was a radical Marxist socialist revolutionary. This is from an article. This is the article title here called Mussolini, More a Man of the Left than of the Right. By 1912, Mussolini was in the leadership circle of Italy's Socialist Party and editing the newspaper Avanti. He was very effective at the job, doubling circulation and personally becoming a widely read radical socialist journalist. One is that he was caught up in the nationalist fervor surrounding the war. Another is that he was mindful of Marx's aphorism and that social revolution usually follows war, and thus saw it as an enabler for what he wanted politically. But speaking for himself at the time, Mussolini was clear, I am and shall remain a socialist, and my convictions will never change. They are bred into my very bones. And looking at the early fascist program, one can see massive overlaps with the socialist agenda of the early 20th century: minimum wage, 8-hour workday, progressive tax on capital, expropriation of uncultivated lands, universal suffrage. So here's two quotes from actual fascists themselves. One of them says, let me tell you this, none of them had sympathy for traditionalism, let alone cried about returning to the past. Figures such as Sergio Panunzio, who saw fascism as the highest realization of Marxism. Nicola Bombaci, who believed that the actions of Mussolini were aligned with the Marxist-Leninist dialectic. Bombaci would aid fascist thought by bringing mainstream communists into the fold. Giovanni Gentile, the main philosopher of fascism, believed that not only did fascist doctrine achieve the only feasible form of socialism, but fascist philosophy had become a form of practical Marxism. Giovanni Gentile does not reject Marx, but rather builds upon Marx by pointing out that Marx was actually a confused idealist and that fascism is in actuality just a better Marxism. In other words, fascism is not anti-Marxism, but more accurately post-Marxism, superior Marxism, or practical Marxism. They're confirming it. These are fascist sources themselves saying they're not against Marxism. They just added on to it like Hitler did. He implemented a command economy of total state control over private business. This is from the article here called Fascism, Socialism with a Capitalist Veneer on Fee. It's a good article. It says, under fascism, the state, through official cartels, controlled all aspects of manufacturing, commerce, finance, and agriculture. Planning boards set product lines, production levels, prices, wages, working conditions, and the size of firms. Licensing was ubiquitous. So it also says here, fascism is to be distinguished from interventionism or the mixed economy. Interventionism seeks to guide the market process, not eliminate it, as fascism did. Minimum wage and antitrust laws, though they regulate the free market, are a far cry from multi-year plans from the Ministry of Economics. So that's also a good point. So we have mixed economies today, but fascists implemented the total strict supervision and control of the economy, which is not the same. It's far closer to the communist system. He never strayed far from his mission to socialize the entire economy, calling for even more strict nationalizations in his 1943 Verona Manifesto. He said on February 12, 1944, Mussolini's cabinet approved a bill of socialization. This spoke about the Mussolinian concept on subjects such as higher social justice, a more equitable distribution of wealth, participation of labor in the... Mussolini claimed that Italian capitalists, the ones who were left, right, the croniest who he left, had betrayed him after they gained immensely from fascism, and he now regretted his alliance with them and rediscovered his old socialist influences. He claimed that he had intended to carry out a large-scale nationalization of property in 1939 and 1940, but that the outbreak of war had forced him to postpone it, and promised that in the future all industrial firms with over 100 employees would be nationalized. Mussolini even reached out to ex-communist Nicola Bombaci, a former student of Lenin, to help him spread the message that the image of fascism was a progressive movement. It says here, the economics of Italian fascism is ignored, trivialized because it's found in today's world economies. Consider the components of fascist economics: central planning, heavy state subsidies, protectionism, high tariffs, steep levels of nationalization, rampant cronyism, large deficits, high government spending, bank and industry bailouts, overlapping bureaucracy, massive social welfare programs, crushing national debt, bouts of inflation, highly regulated, multi-class, integrated national economic structure, state capitalism. Yeah, it's the same thing as socialism. Socialism is state capitalism. It's the same. It's when the state is the capitalist and not the private business owner. The private businessman is no longer the main capitalist. It's the state. The state is the capitalist in the sense that only the state can do business, only the state can set the rules, only the state can do the investing, only the state can own a company. He also says in here that Mussolini had bragged. Let me find if that's it. Bragged. He said that 75%, I'm not sure if it's in this article, but he said that 75% of the economy was in state hands. So it says fascist Italy was among the first Western states to recognize the regime of Lenin and the Soviet Union. He signed a robust friendship and trade pact with the Soviets in 1933. Are these the beliefs and actions of an anti-communist or a crypto-communist LARPing as something else? So just think about it. He's got this totally planned economy, 75% in the hands of the state. And then he says, actually, I wanted to go further than that. I wanted to nationalize everything. I just didn't have time to do it, buddy. Right? He hires Nicola Bombacci. So this guy, Nicola Bombacci, let me pull him up. He's a communist. Nicola Bombacci was an Italian Marxist revolutionary and a fascist politician. Began in the Italian Socialist Party, moved to the Italian Communist Party, was a founding member of that party, later became Mussolini's lieutenant. He was murdered alongside Mussolini. It says, before his execution, Bombacci shouted, "Long live Mussolini! Long live socialism!" And then he was shot. So he's yelling, "Long live socialism." It's so hilarious. He gets killed by communist partisans, and he is a communist. He's the founder of the Communist Party in Italy, one of the founders. This is just socialist infighting at this point, right? So that's how we have to view this. Socialists do infight a ton. They fight each other to the death, right? You had the Bolsheviks versus Mensheviks, Stalin versus Trotsky. Stalin executed tons of communists in the Soviet Union. Zinoviev and Kamenev, many of his top officials, he had them all executed. He has an ice pick in the skull of Trotsky. Communists fight communists all the time. They quarrel and squabble over everything. And not only that, but fascists fight fascists. You had Hitler do the Night of the Long Knives. He kills the Strasser, Gregor Strasser. He killed Ernst Röhm. Both of them were hardcore National Socialists. Hitler killed Dollfuss in Austria, the leader of Austria, who was also a fascist. Mussolini almost went to war with Hitler. He was actually trying to protect Dollfuss, and he was saber rattling against Hitler in the early days. So Hitler and Mussolini almost went to war with each other. Let me pull up this other quote from Hitler here, where he said that he backed the wrong horse in Spain, and he should have backed the Reds. Says this from David Irving. Says in early November 1937, Hitler told staff that an outright Franco victory was not desirable. Our interest is in maintaining existing tensions in the Med. Franco was fighting the communist-backed Republicans was of second importance. In April 1938, Hitler would muse out loud to Reinhard Spitze, Ribbentrop's secretary, that we've backed the wrong horse in Spain. We would have done better to back the Republicans. They represent the people. We could always have converted these socialists into good National Socialists later. The people around Franco are all reactionary clerics, aristocrats, and moneybags. They've got nothing in common with us Nazis at all. And that was confirmed by numerous other sources, such as Albert Speer's memoir. It says the same thing. Hitler actually defended the Red atrocities and said, he says, the idealism is to be found among the Reds and not Franco. Certainly they pillaged and desecrated, but so did Franco's men, without having any good reason for it. The Reds were working off centuries of hatred for the church, which always oppressed the Spanish people. And then he kind of threatened to employ the Reds later. So, again, double speaking. He has all these sympathies for the socialist side, right? It says here, fascists are therefore little more than Marxist socialists wrapped up in a flag and patriotic sentiment. Thus, fascists can never truly be anti-communist because they are a variation of communist. The Hitler-Stalin fight is an example of socialist infighting, like the Mensheviks versus Bolsheviks, Stalin versus Trotsky. And on top of that, it was a fight over resources and land and not really about ideology. Moreover, Mussolini did not even like the fact that Hitler attacked Stalin and pleaded with him to make a peace deal. This quote says, earlier in April 1943, Mussolini begged Hitler to make a separate peace with Stalin and send German troops to the west to guard against the unexpected Allied invasion. Mussolini did not view the Soviets as a big enemy for obvious reasons. They were fellow brother socialists. Rather, he viewed the Western plutocracies as the great oppressors of his proletarian nation trying to make its way in the world. Mussolini was channeling Lenin without all that sentiment about Italy being an oppressed victim of the bigger power, striving to break free from the chains of bondage by erecting its own empire and colonization of Slavic lands for Italian expansion. So Mussolini had his own version of Lebensraum. It says, borrowing the idea first by Enrico Corradini before 1914 of the natural conflict between plutocratic nations like Britain and the proletarian nations like Italy. Pure Marxism there, that's pure Leninism. Mussolini claimed that Italy's principal problem was that plutocratic countries like Britain were blocking Italy from achieving the necessary spazio vitale that would let the Italian economy grow. Mussolini equated a nation's potential economic growth with territorial size. Thus, in his view, the problem of poverty in Italy could only be solved with spazio vitale. Mussolini was first and foremost a radical economic socialist who hated capitalism and democracy and classical liberalism above all. So Stalin's socialist autocracy was much more to his liking. Stalin's socialist autocracy was also more to Hitler's liking, as he expressed privately. So let's kind of recap the 6 points here that refute the idea that Hitler was anti-communist, truly anti-communist, and it was fighting Stalin because of that. So 1, the top Natsok stated homicidal contempt for Slavs. If he truly was trying to save the Slavic peoples, why is he spewing all this hatred of Slavs? Why is he saying they're inferior? 2, clear statements from Hitler himself on his plans for conquest of new land, Lebensraum. That was an undeniable fact. Lebensraum was the mission of Hitler. It was his number one foreign policy goal, and that was the main reason he clashed with Stalin. We saw that from David Irving, where he said, if Stalin had just gone south and didn't want these eastern lands, then we would have no issue. 3, his Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Stalin gave him the green light to conquer parts of Poland and the Baltics. So if he's giving the green light for Stalin, a communist, to Bolshevize Eastern Poland, to Bolshevize the Baltics, does he really care about that? Does he really give a damn if these people have communism over their heads? No, he doesn't. He helped bring it there. 4, a July 1941 secret meeting between Hitler and top brass in which Hitler states clearly that the liberator narrative was public-facing propaganda to win support for Barbarossa, but the real agenda was to dominate, minister, and exploit the newly acquired Slavic lands. Direct documentary evidence that was a facade, a false front. 5, Hitler's private statements of admiration for Stalin and his socialist autocracy. He said one thing in public and another thing in private. He was always doing that. 6, fascist economics being so similar to its Soviet counterpart that fascist claims of anti-communism are hollow propaganda born of an internecine brother war with fellow socialists. So that economic point, I think, is very important here to debunk these claims. If you're truly anti-communist, you're against the economics of communism, because communism is mainly economics. There are social elements to it, like the opiate of the masses thing that Marx talked about to destroy religion, and then Engels was against the nuclear family and so on. But they can tweak all that social stuff. Like Stalin, for example, banned homosexuality later on in the regime. He tweaked, he banned abortion at one point. So the social issues can be played with communists. They will play with it. Like Castro was anti-gay as well. Are you going to say Stalin's not a communist because he implemented a few social conservative policies? What makes him a communist is the economics, right? It's the state ownership of the means of production. That's the communism. That's the main thrust of it, is the abolition of private property and the collectivization, the communalization of all land, business, capital, labor, everything socialized, turned into the state. And that's exactly what fascism is about, right? Is socializing not only the economy, but the people as well, making them slaves of the state, right? So this is from the doctrine of fascism right here. Let me just go over a few points here. The doctrine of fascism says anti-individualistic, fascist conception of life stresses the importance of the state and accepts the individual only insofar as his interests coincide with those of the state. So what that is saying here is that the individual, which they're defining as essentially a citizen that's not part of the state, the individual, but that's kind of neither here nor there, because obviously someone who's a member of the state also has the laws applied to him. He's also an individual, and he also has the government laws applied to him. It's not like if you're part of the state, you can just do whatever. I guess, like, technically you could. You can break the law if you're part of the state. I mean, some of them can, but you're supposed to follow the laws as well. You're also an individual. But what he's saying here is that you cannot oppose the state. You cannot go against the state. You only have rights insofar as you follow along with the state. You coincide with the state. So if we just take like one example of that, like speech, for example. So what he's saying here is that you don't have freedom of speech if you are against the state. So if you're critical of the state and you're writing a newspaper and you're criticizing the state, well, you no longer have the right to speak, to free speech, because you're going against the state. You can only speak. We'll give you the right to free speech if you agree with every state policy. So the second you disagree with state policy, we take away your right to free speech, which means you don't even have it. It's not there. You don't, unless you can criticize the government, you don't have free speech, right? Like it's illusory. He says the will of man is a historic entity. It's opposed to classical liberalism, which arose as a reaction to absolutism and exhausted its historical function when the state became the expression of the conscience and will of the people. Liberalism denied the state in the name of the individual. Fascism reasserts the rights of the state as expressing the real essence of the individual. So once again, this is this psychobabble. It's bafflegab. It's just this superfluous language, this nonsense. He's saying we deny the rights of the individual, meaning the citizen. You don't have any rights. The state has rights. And I've pointed out the huge problem with this is that if the state has rights over individuals always, meaning the state is always correct, the state can intervene and do whatever it wants, then you're forced to just do whatever the state says, no matter what. And I'm saying that if this applies to the fascist state, then it applies to all states. Why would it only apply to a fascist state? Why would only the fascist variant of a state get the rights over the individuals, but all other types of states, like democratic ones or religious theocracies or monarchies, why would all those types of states not have rights over the individuals to do whatever they wished? Obviously, the state doesn't have rights over individuals. It has the power over the individuals, over the citizens. It is the use of force. That's it. It's just the power. They don't have any God-given right over these people, right? And so if you cannot oppose the state by this doctrine, then if the state decides to jab a vaccine in your arm, you have to agree with it. If the state, like the COVID policies, they come in and knock down your door and kidnap your grandma and stick a poison cocktail in her arm, and mandating a vax mandate throughout the society, you have to agree with it because the state has the rights over you and you're just an individual and you have no rights. So you can't protest COVID tyranny. Like our states right now are doing all these things that you don't like, right? They do all these terrible things. They're imposing transgenderism and LGBT and mass immigration and diversity and hate speech laws and all that stuff you don't like. The state is imposing it, and this doctrine is telling you you can't oppose it. You cannot protest it. You cannot fight against it because you're an individual and individuals have no rights, because that's classical liberalism. Having rights is classical liberalism, meaning any rights, whether that's the right to protest, the right to not be vaxxed, the right to bear arms, the speech rights. None of that exists because fascism says that's bad, right? It says, and if liberty is to be the attribute of living men and not abstract dummies invented by individualistic liberalism, then fascism stands for liberty. And for the only liberty worth having, the liberty of the state and of the individual within the state. So there it is again, the bafflegab. It's just hijacking these words and redefining them. We believe in liberty so long as you agree with everything that the state does. That's your liberty. You're free to agree with the state, goy. Right? So Klaus Schwab and Bill Gates and all the politicians come and say, you're free to agree with us, to agree with the vaccine. You're free to agree with the Great Reset. You're free to agree that we're going to ban meat and make you eat bugs, but you have real freedom. It's 1984 rhetoric, right? It's bafflegab. The fascist conception of the state is all-embracing. Outside of it, no human or spiritual values can exist, much less value. Thus, understood, fascism is totalitarian, and the fascist state, a synthesis in a unit inclusive of all values, interprets, develops, and potentates the whole life of the people. Again, everything in the state, nothing outside the state. That's the mantra of fascism. That's the basis of it. That's the, if you distill it down, that's like the root of it, is that you have no rights, you're an individual, individuals have no rights, the state has the right to do whatever it wants. It says no individuals or groups, political parties, cultural associations, economic unions, social classes are outside of the state. So everything in the state sucks. So this is what I pointed out, is that means also private property. Why stop at cultural associations, political parties, economic unions, and social classes? Also property. Property is outside the state. They have to control the property, so they're going to bring it in the state eventually, right? They're going to nationalize all of it, as Mussolini said he was going to do. Fascism is therefore opposed to socialism, to which unity within the state, which amalgamates classes into a single economic and ethical reality, is unknown, and which sees history as nothing but class struggle. Fascism is likewise opposed to trade unionism as a class weapon, but when brought within the orbit of the state, fascism recognizes the real needs which gave rise to socialism and trade unionism, giving them due weight in the guild or corporative system in which the divergent interests are coordinated and harmonized in the unity of the state. This is all bafflegab. It's like, we're against socialism, but we are socialists. We're against trade unionism, but we are trade unionists. In fact, fascism is based off of trade unionism. That's what it is. It's syndicalism. Syndicalism is when the unions collectivize the economy and control each sector through the union. And then that has to be controlled essentially by a state. And that's what fascism is. It's just controlling all of that through the state, right? It's just nationalizing all the unions and thus having the state run everything from a top-down manner. And that's the exact same thing in the Soviet Union, right? The Soviet councils, and they were all guided by the Politburo and on the top. So all economic decisions are made at the top, and then down it goes in the chain of custody, chain of command. Nothing outside the state. If nothing can be outside the state, then private property is going to be abolished, right? So they're not anti-communists. They are communists. They're a variation of communists. They're communists wrapped up in a flag, wrapped up in patriotism, or wrapped up in ethnocentrism in the form of Hitler's version of it. They're kindred spirits here. This is the point here. So they're not anti-communist. When they call themselves anti-communist, they're being dishonest. It's false advertising. I think we need to understand that. I think we need to shatter the mythology around this, because there is a lot of lies. Because Marxists distort this subject totally. They try to deny these ties and the close proximity between fascism and communism. Fascists actually admit it. Like, you can go, I have a page on my site, you can go read it, called Fascists Admit Fascism is Communism, in which there's numerous fascists saying that, yeah, it's pretty much the same thing, and they're proud of it. So, like, the fascists will say that, but they'll always say that when they're trying to, like, win over left-wing socialists to fascism, right, or to, like, patriotism. They're just adding patriotism to the socialist economic program. And so they'll do this as a term of endearment. They'll be like, yeah, fascism, look how left-wing it is on economics. This is great. And then they're doing that as a pitch to, like, leftists, right? They're doing it as a pitch to kind of Bernie bro socialists. Hey, guys, come over here, right? Add this thing to it. But then if you attack it from the other angle, like I'm doing, where I'm critiquing it and saying, oh, the reason it's bad is because it is like communism. The reason fascism is bad is because it is socialism. It is true socialism. It's true state ownership of the means of production. It's just the near total elimination of private property, at least eventually, right? They didn't succeed in eliminating all of it because it's a long process. But I think the trick of fascism was that they would kind of give this veneer, this facade of private property to not scare everybody off, and that's why they called it practical Marxism. That's why Giovanni Gensau called it. It's practical in the sense that we're not going to just run and grab everybody's property right away. We'll slowly do it. We'll slowly but surely do it. It's like that boiling the frog method. Slowly turn up the heat. And then by the end of it, we're almost entirely in control of all property, of all land, of all capital, of all labor, all production guided through the state. But like it's incremental, and that's why they called it practical, because if they had just come in and seized everybody's property, it would have pissed everyone off. They would have revolted. And so they had to do it in a kind of a slower, more incremental manner. And that's the same thing that like democratic socialists or Fabian socialists promote as well. Is not like the Leninist abrupt revolutions, take control of the state, seize all the property, shoot the landowners, shoot the kulaks, starve them to death because they're fighting us. They got their pitchforks. We want to keep our land. Nah, destroy them. So yeah, that's really the only difference there, though. All right, we're gonna end that here. Good discussion. I will have another similar type video, economic kind of related video coming up soon, and I will post this on all the channels.